Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 9, The Unknown Conditions of Palestine, of A Long Civilization's Trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 11, December 1937. A Long Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note. This is the 9th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. The Unknown Conditions of Palestine. Turning down a steep incline, we entered at the bottom a large flagged courtyard, closed in on either side of us by a massive, somber granite block wall. In front of us, the third side of the courtyard, was a fairly large edifice of the same depressing hue. The natural grey of the stone had been darkened by years of rain which had streaked the stone with black. It reminded me, with its arched entrance reached by descending the flight of well-worn steps, of the Temple of Justice in Paris, former prison during the French Revolution. This fortress-like structure was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The authenticity of this purported tomb of the Christ is much disputed. Now lying in the center of modern Jerusalem, it at one time was just outside the walls of the city. The Christian literature of the first 3 centuries made absolutely no reference to the empty tomb. If it had been known in the past and venerated, it certainly would have been destroyed. So historians state, during the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, 70 AD, and the great devastation of the Bar Kokhlos rebellion. The Roman Emperor Hadrian restored the city in 135 AD and erected over the tomb a temple dedicated to the pagan goddess Aphrodite. 200 years later, Macarius removed the temple and found an ancient Jewish tomb. Rock was cut away from the tomb and a circular building, the Anastasius, was built around it. Over this was built the present medieval building. That the tomb inside is the one located by Macarius is undisputable, but there is no proof, it is argued, that it was the Christ's tomb. Speculation runs high as to outside of just which gate of Jerusalem the crucifixion actually took place, for that fact would assist in determining the site of the actual tomb. The inside of the rotunda was dimly lighted by candles. On either side, against the walls, like concessions at an exposition, were the altars and accoutrements of the various Christian sects which have property rights in the buildings and share the honor of preserving the site. Even to one who might not be strictly orthodox and therefore not unduly sensitive, the ostentatious display was offensive. Each sect had tried not to make its shrine more dignified or symbolic of the sanctity of the place, but more pretentious, just as a merchant would, to dominate the attention of passers-by. This obvious competition within the confines of the sacred shrine itself has led to many disputes, culminating in bloodshed. How disillusioning, was our paramount thought as we left the edifice, must a visit to the place be to religious pilgrims? We discussed the circumstances and our impressions freely in the presence of our guide, Soul, as we prepared to take photographs of the exterior. He had been attentively listening, for he said, "Your views are different from many who come to visit. To you, God does not bestow blessings only upon those who profess to know his ways, but as well upon those who follow them, whether they know they are his ways or not." We explained that we were not creedists, feeling that we could understand God without reducing our understanding to dogma. We further explained that, in our opinion, the errors which existed in any religion were not in motive, but in interpretation and application. "Precisely," he replied, "and so I shall express myself in my book." "You are writing a book?" I queried, studying carefully his enigmatic face. "I am now a Christian, although I am an Arab. I was a Mohammedan, and I feel qualified to make a comparison between these two great faiths, and of this my book shall consist." "And is it possible that your book might bring greater harmony between your people and the Jews?" I asked, risking a challenging question. If my question surprised him, his face did not reveal it, but his eye held mine as he replied in a deliberate manner. "You are Americans, not involved in the situation which exists here. I feel that I can speak freely to you." This he did, giving us an understanding of the turbulent state not obtained from the others, whose views have been more publicized because of the means at their disposal. The conditions which exist in Palestine, he began, are not solely due to religious differences between the Arabs and Jews, as many of the leading newspapers of the world would have their readers believe. We have had as next-door neighbors for decades, Jews who deal with us and we with them. Our mutual respect has been heightened by fair dealings and an equal assumption of social, political, and economic responsibilities. In the controversy that exists, these Jews, our neighbors and our friends, support us. Palestine is a land which, even in your short stay, he continued, his voice now quivering with emotion, you must have already observed, is incapable of supporting agriculturally a numerous people. With the exception of the Jordan Valley, a fertile strip, it is nearly a barren land and requires a very hardy people to subsist on it. We and the Jews who have been established here are not selfish, but we know that an influx of population will bring ruin to all here who are now enjoying no more than life's necessities. We listened intently, impressed by his earnestness. Propaganda in England and in America and conditions in Germany have encouraged thousands upon thousands of Jews to enter Palestine with the belief that it was to become a new kingdom of Judea, a land of affluence. This migration has been encouraged by certain money interests that have bought worthless lands in Palestine and sold them sight unseen to the immigrants before they left their homes in other lands. These newcomers are mostly not agriculturists or even unaccustomed to manual labor. They arrive nearly destitute. A few weeks' hardship on the soil of Palestine proves to them that they cannot support themselves upon it, and being financially unable to return to their original homes, they move into our cities and towns. They by nature are barterers, merchants, and they set up numerous little stalls. One cannot call them shops. They are forced to live like cattle by circumstance, and thus undersell by far the rest of us, even their own kind who have been established here. This unfair competition reduces living standards, wages fall, business suffers, and we all starve. Still they keep pouring in to be in turn deceived. Not a word of these conditions reaches the outside world. The British press and others continue to tell the world at large how Palestine is fulfilling a prophecy of becoming a new kingdom of hope and prosperity for the Jews. We have pleaded with England, who exercises the Palestine Mandate, to restrict immigration and to establish a quota for Palestine, allowing a limited number to enter annually, a number that new business, industry and development can rightly assimilate. This has been promised periodically, but still there is actually no quota in existence. A people can stand only so much deprivation, then the law of their being causes them to retaliate, to struggle for survival and for those little things which make life worth living. If, we reasoned, we could paralyze transportation and all commerce in Palestine, we could force the world to realize our despicable circumstances. We no longer operate the railroads. Those that are operated are done so by the British Army. We permit no trucking, manufacturing or conducting of usual business. This is very harsh and lawless, you may think, but we fight for life and the lives of our loved ones. Britain and other nations have great interests here. Their financial resources are affected by these conditions. Pressure was brought upon the British Parliament to establish normalcy. We have been threatened but have not complied with the demands. The military force has undertaken to operate mills and supervise institutions. This display of force has caused hatred, and my people have resorted to the same means. They harass Britain's troops. They prefer to bring about a settlement by treaty and compromise, but their pleas are met by a cruel overriding by the military might. In the national treasury of Palestine, there was a small reserve sum of $6 million. We are being penalized for our attempted existence. The expense of transporting troops, supplies and war materials here from England to oppose us is being paid out of these reserve funds. We shall never surrender or submit to such conditions. Our people are used to these hills. They were raised in them. Armed and in them, they can resist a trained and fully equipped British force of 50,000 troops indefinitely. America, he stated, apparently to placate us, if anything he had said might have offended, would surely be more considerate of our needs. We selected her at the close of the World War to exercise the mandate over Palestine, but she refused. Fortunately, I replied, for undoubtedly she might have confronted the same conditions, and how she would have reacted to them one cannot truthfully say. Is there, I asked, much loss of life? Listen tonight, an hour after sunset. You will hear the crack of rifles from various directions, he said. with a glint in his eyes. The chattering reply you will then hear is the machine guns of the British. When British troops rush one section, Arab snipers harass them from another. We do not like these methods, but our conduct is the cry of a people in distress. We have the moral and material support, he proudly added, of all the Islamic peoples of Syria, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq and Arabia. The British are usually fair in their dealings, I began. He interrupted. I speak no condemnation of the British people as a whole. They have been our friends. Those who have lived here before and understand have deplored their country's action and protested. But mercenary interests have stifled their pleadings, and the homeland knows not the true facts. We had walked as we talked. Carefully, we plotted our campaign for the next day. Bidding Soul good evening, we retired to our hotel. That evening, we dined with the most prominent British officers stationed in Palestine in the simple, unpretentious dining salon of the hotel. A British officer of rank is a cultured gentleman. No matter how far from his native land, he never relaxes his customs, manners, or poise. Each evening, though men only were present, every officer dressed for dinner in his dinner jacket as meticulously as though visiting some smart restaurant on the Strand with his lady. An Englishman never permits himself to become influenced by environment and social conditions into which he is thrust. It can be said that wherever an Englishman is, there is England. This reveals a most pure strain of nationality. It does not mean superiority, but rather a stronger allegiance to a chain of traditions. An American is more easily swayed by environment and will assimilate the customs and practices about him quickly, sometimes good, sometimes bad. For example, though the clocks of the hotel had accurate Palestine time, these officers gathered about the single radio receiver which the hotel afforded to secure London time by short wave, and then adjusted their watches accordingly for the number of hours difference between that and the local time. What American would set his time in Palestine by a New York broadcast if he could have obtained it from the local clocks? Such is the influence tradition asserts on a Briton. The brilliant sunlight of the next morning was encouraging. We had feared it would be overcast from the appearance of the skies in the evening. Our equipment was all prepared. We carried with us 4 magazines of film representing several thousand feet, and all of the necessary shades and filters and accessories for the successful operation, we hoped, of our equipment. A 20-minute walk brought us to what had originally been the outskirts of the ancient city of Jerusalem. Before us was an attractive tower-like church, a gift to the Roman Catholics of Jerusalem by the former Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Passing through a large gateway, we entered a pleasant garden, quiet and serene. Crossing this to the Gothic doorway, we pulled on a weather-beaten rope hanging there and heard from the interior the distant tinkling of a small bell. A few seconds later, the door opened, disclosing a pleasant-faced father, middle-aged, portly, wearing sandals and clerical garb. Our guide explained to him in French our purpose, that we desired to ascend to the top of the tower, which structure had the greatest height in that vicinity, to photograph views of the surrounding terrain. It was rather an unusual request, this we realized. After studying us carefully for a moment or two, he kindly consented. After winding our way to the top of a tower by means of a circular stone stairway, which permitted the passage of just one person at a time, we were rewarded for our effort. There before us was spread a goodly section of modern Jerusalem. In the great distance could be seen a portion of the Dead Sea. See photograph in June 1937, issue of the Rosicrucian Digest. Slightly to our left was a hill, not great in height, but higher than the surrounding land. It was perfectly bare. At one time it was covered with olive trees and was in fact the Mount of Olives upon which had been located the historical Garden of Gethsemane. Turning to our guide, I stated, "I presume that the olive trees were removed centuries ago?" "To the contrary," he replied. "The Mount of Olives was covered with olive trees until during the World War, when Palestine was occupied and dominated by Turkish forces. Due to the embargo by British ships, the Turks were not able to obtain coal to operate the trains through Palestine, and being badly in need of fuel, the olive trees were felled by the Turks and used to fire their locomotives." Here again was another indication of the fact that war is no respecter of traditions, historical sites, or even sacred places. Being satisfied that we could get no better view than this, we spent considerable time filming the vista before us. I was particularly impressed with this little church. After departing from the tower, I entered the chapel. Its simplicity was impressive, restful, a place where one could quickly depart in thought and feeling from the rest of the world. No lavishness, no attempted display, just the cool grey walls, the plain hardwood pews, the high altar beautifully carved of teak wood. High above it, some light filtered through a stained glass window, forming a geometrical pattern on the mosaic floor and heightening the shadows on either side of the chapel. But we had to hurry away, for our time was limited. From here we were to proceed to the historical town of Bethlehem. The only transportation was burros. Getting astride these small animals, we jogged the entire distance of 6 miles along a modern highway to Bethlehem. To passing troops in motor lorries, we must have presented an amusing spectacle, but the only means of transportation were these burros, with the exception of the military trucks and lorries. We felt fortunate that we could go even by this means. We were accustomed to horseback riding, which we enjoy, but there is a great difference in riding a horse and a burro, as one soon learns. The stride of the burro is shorter, more jerky, and far more breathtaking. A ride of 3 or 4 miles by burro is as fatiguing to one not used to it as a ride of several hours on horseback. Midway, we stopped at the Well of the Magi. See photograph February 1937 issue of the Rosicrucian Digest. This well today is the same in appearance as it must have been in the time of Christ and before. Back of it is a grove of olive trees. There have always been olive trees there in the memory of the oldest inhabitants. The well is now dry and has been dry in the memory of the oldest inhabitants. There is no doubt as to its authenticity, for historical records as well as legend point to this well as the common meeting and stopping place of travelers and those going to and fro from Jerusalem or Bethlehem. Caravans used to pass there, as well as those driving their flocks from one section to another in search of new pastures. I was deeply impressed as I sat on the edge of this well and thought of the brethren of the mystic schools who conversed here while refreshing themselves with the well's cool water. Further on, we passed the round, silo-like tomb of Rachel, another truly authenticated historic place, although unimpressive, along the same famous highway. Rounding a bend in the road, we had a panorama of the hills surrounding Bethlehem, to which so much reference is made in the New Testament. We could visualize the shepherds there watching over their flocks. We could realize why, since the shepherds played such a prominent part in the life of the people of that time, there were so many parables concerning their conduct. It was simple for people to grasp the significance of such parables. Lorry after lorry of troops and armored cars passed us, hurrying to Bethlehem. Once the highway over which the wise men traveled, those predicting the coming of the great Avatar, and the road over which the Christ himself rode and preached to the passers-by of the coming of a new era, it is now an avenue for the quick moving of machinery of destruction and the armies of war. We were more impressed with our entrance into Bethlehem than into Jerusalem. All streets were exceptionally tortuous, twisting, winding and rough with cobble and flagstones. Hardly anyone in Western garb was to be seen. All were robed much like the pictures and paintings we have of the people of biblical times. We were held up occasionally to let a herd of goats or a flock of sheep pass us by. Finally, the narrow street on which we traveled opened into a wider thoroughfare, and there before us was the Church of Nativity, the birthplace of Christ. Immediately before it was a large plaza, elevated just a few feet above the approaching street. Like most all of these ancient buildings, it was not welcoming but somber, depressing, the very massiveness of the stone conveying the feeling of coldness and dreariness. The windows were small and slit-like. The entrance into the church itself was so low that one had to bow his head to enter. Most astounding to us, however, was the fact that the lorries which had been passing us with troops and war supplies were making this plaza before the Church of the Nativity their destination. This great space was to be used as a temporary barracks and storage area for war materials. Stacked high were cartons, cases and bundles, and the black, ugly, large metal containers of crude oil and gasoline needed for the mechanized equipment of the British troops. Stacked also, almost in front of the very entrance into the Church of the Nativity, were rifles. The troops stood idly by, awaiting further orders. Machine guns were mounted on the adjacent wall, surveying the whole area as a protective means. A goodly portion of the Hebrew population stood by, curiously watching. We entered the church and walked from chamber to chamber. From these very chambers, each Christmas morning, a sermon is broadcast throughout the world. In fact, 90 days later, during the greatest strife in Palestine, with all of these armaments about, a message of peace and hope was issued to humanity. Fortunately, the listeners throughout the world could not see the conditions existing where this message originated, or they would perhaps have had their faith in the message somewhat shaken. We were permitted to take pictures of this place and found it extremely difficult to avoid including modern troops and war paraphernalia in the scenes of this holy site. Returning once again to Jerusalem, and after visiting many other historic places about which there is dispute as to their authenticity, we were fortunate in being able to photograph the building which legend and tradition declare is the place where the Last Supper of Christ was held. Even most historians are of the belief that this structure was undoubtedly the original edifice. Strange that this chamber, which means so much to Christians, to philosophers and mystics who are all somewhat in dispute as to the real purpose and object of the Last Supper, is now a Mohammedan mosque. The Mohammedans themselves confirm the legend that it is the place where Christ's Last Supper was held. They appreciate its sacredness to Christians. Everyone is permitted to visit it. It is a long chamber about 60 feet in length and about 40 feet in width, with 2 rows of rather stout columns down the center. It has a very low, arched ceiling and is dark except for 2 narrow windows at one end, and which emit very little light, and candles which are placed about the wall. The stone floor is covered, as is the custom in mosques, with exquisite and very old and valuable oriental rugs. Unlike many of the other sites of interest to tourists and Christian pilgrims, now controlled by Christian sects, no fees were asked for admission. One could make a contribution as he left, but the Mohammedans did not seem to expect it or ask for it. This contrast in custom was very noticeable to us and certainly complimentary to the Mohammedans. We returned to the hotel just before the curfew hour. We found a flurry of excitement. The High Commissioner had requested additional troops for Palestine. During the night before, an attack had been made upon his executive mansion and the rebellion was growing. Tomorrow we would begin our journey away from Palestine into the interior of lands populated by people thought by Christians to be heathens, even pagans, or at least enemies of that for which Christianity stands. Had Christianity set such a marvelous example for them to aspire to? Had it succeeded as well as one would imagine from the reading of its literature and its glowing terms of promise, when the birthplace of its idealism and its greatest exponent was steeped in war and bloodshed and seething with hatred? Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.